Good afternoon. Welcome. Thank you for coming. My name is Simone Cavallaro. I'm the director of the Stigler Center. We're happy to host Brian for the second day of his mini course on corporate political influence in the US. Brian has been visiting at the Stigler Center for a few months. Thanks, Brian, for joining us. Please remember that we are on the record and live streaming, so please silence your phones. Also, the views expressed by our guests are their own, not those of the Stigler Center or the University of Chicago. This is our last public event of this school year, but please check our website for updates soon. We have many initiatives at the Stigler Center, but there is one that in particular that I'd like to highlight. This year we released a new podcast, Capitalism, hosted by Luigi Zingales and Kate Waldock, on what works and what doesn't in capitalism today. If you haven't already, please check it out and leave a review on Apple Podcasts. Yesterday, Brian spoke on corporate-linked money. Today, we look forward to hearing from him on alternative sources of influence for corporations. Please join me in welcoming Brian Richter.
Okay, well, thank you for having me back again and for the last couple months here. It's a little bit sad realizing that I'm only here for another 2 weeks after tomorrow. So today we're going to talk about stuff that I think actually gets a little bit more interesting in that we start talking about things that don't show up in the media as much. The money stuff we talked about yesterday, I think people don't fully grasp, and there's a lot of sort of vagaries around how that stuff is regulated. The things today are kind of newer and thinking about things in a different way. Just sort of recap from last time, we were focusing a lot on kind of money and politicians going back and forth, and we were thinking about just kind of the relationship between the two, and largely kind of grounded in an economics view of the world on there's capture and where's the money come from. This is the Stigler Center, right? So this idea that firms want to capture politicians and have a desire to fundamentally comes from him. In reframing the debate, we got to Tullock, and Tullock is this political economy scholar who asks this famous paradox about why isn't there more money in politics, given how much the potential benefits could be and how little money we seem to observe, so the returns seem too high. We kind of formalized that a little bit, right? And we were thinking last time, about really the denominator in this return equation that really, the amount of money that we observe is sort of falsely low because there are all sorts of other sources of influence or ways that money is being spent on politics or make political investments that we don't see, and so we're just not sort of properly accounting for things. So what we want to do today is sort of expand beyond this, and this is where we concluded yesterday, was that we've got this sort of economics literature on capture that's looking a lot at money going back and forth between politicians and firms. We hadn't really thought a lot about voters, and voters in particular end up being embedded in districts, and that's something that matters a lot to politicians. So my large focus of the political science literature and kind of the core thing in political science is do voters get represented or do people get represented and how? And so we're going to think a lot more about that and what politicians are maybe thinking about in terms of when they interact with firms. And so to sort of build a better understanding of the business-politician relationship, we really need to get into this view of what do politicians care about. This brings us to Peltzman, who is really the other side to Stigler. So Peltzman is an emeritus professor here. And was here for a long time with Stigler, and he took Stigler's model of capture and this idea that firms would want to capture politicians and expanded it. And in particular, he did this by bringing in the idea that politicians actually do care about votes, and that's something that they're fundamentally interested in. Peltzman, in a lot of ways, is building on David Mayhew, who's a political scientist, who sort of wrote this book about the electoral connection and really frame members of Congress in a way that people hadn't quite been thinking about them as before, which is just the sole goal, right? If you're a politician, is to get reelected, right? And so if you think about a politician's utility function, that's the thing that you want to do. There's 3 ways to get there. You can advertise what you're doing, right? So you can get in your district in front of people so people know that you exist. You can do things that you're claiming credit for doing things that are good for your constituents, right? And so having a connection to constituents in a direct way and being able to say, hey, I did this, I made progress on something is very useful. And then position taking is the last thing, which is different necessarily than legislating or making policy. So position taking being the idea that you can say all sorts of stuff that's not necessarily going to become policy, but that's appealing to your constituents. And so a little bit different than the idea of credit claiming. So that in this roundabout way is going to bring us to today and that what we're going to talk about today. So we're going to talk about social responsibility and corporate social responsibility reputations of firms and how that relates to political influence and how firms might actually be able to use that for political influence. So different than last time where we were talking about charitable donations from corporate foundations. Again, there's sort of this blurry line here of what's what and how this is being used, but we'll get into some more specifics. We're going to talk a little bit more explicitly in sort of getting to characteristics of voters and how politicians might care about that, about constituents themselves versus money and how we might be able to sort of frame a trade-off there if there is a trade-off. And then finally we'll get into stuff on redistricting and the political districts that firms are embedded in, which is where my research is mostly headed right now and thinking about the political geography of firms and why that might be relevant and helpful in terms of thinking about political influence, really taking on, trying to bridge from firms directly over to politicians. So getting into the corporate social responsibility work, there's at least two ways that, beyond the stuff we talked about last time, which was some of my work showing that, firms spend more on campaign contribution or charitable contributions if they're constrained in terms of campaign contributions and the Bertrand et al. Work that looks at, charitable donations, as really a conduit or hidden sorts of money, that there can also be other things that corporate social responsibility, more broadly defined than just making charitable donations, can actually do for politics. And this is thinking about how corporate social responsibility practices at a firm and maybe even taking sort of explicit positions on doing some activity can be benefited by being embedded in the law. And firms can actually help politicians pass laws. They can help politicians write laws. And in the process, they can create a win-win for the politician that helps their firm vis-a-vis other firms. In some instances here, the public tends to view lobbying as this thing that always leads to socially inefficient outcomes. Politicians do want to generally make the best decisions. Broadly, they're going to stick there in the long run, and to do that, firms can actually be helpful in sort of guiding that process if firms are sort of thinking about this. The other way that CSR can matter for influencing politicians is actually thinking about how do politicians appear, right? So thinking about Mayhew to their districts and how they can advertise themselves, right? So are they associating with firms that are good firms, may actually help their reputation with constituents and with voters. And if you're a firm that's perceived as doing something bad, that may actually be something that a politician wants to distance themselves from because you don't want to be too cozy with these bad guys, and that's going to potentially hurt you getting reelected. And so social responsibility can matter in these two ways. Just looking at data and thinking about data on social responsibility and whether or not firms are engaged in politics is sort of a good way to start into this. There's a relationship between the two. So the blue is a histogram of firms that do lobby, and the red is a histogram of firms that don't lobby. And so left, right, if you're above 0, you're better at social responsibility. If you're below 0, you're worse at social responsibility. There's problems with how that's measured. But what we end up seeing is that there is this relationship where firms that sort of are middling in social responsibility tend not to lobby as much. Firms that are extremely socially responsible tend to lobby a lot or tend to be more engaged in the political process. Same with firms who are sort of the trailing edge. We can think of a variety of reasons why that might be true. If you're sort of at the trailing edge, you maybe don't want the laws to catch up with the bad things that you're doing. And so you're lobbying on that end to try to have laws not change. And we know sort of anecdotally that's a harder position to take in lobbying than actually looking at something that's going to be a more socially efficient outcome, sort of pushing laws forward. And so we also see firms spending money on that end. Those firms don't necessarily spend as much and maybe get outcomes that are still favorable to them in some particularistic way. So there's actually a long historical precedent of ties between social responsibility and politics. So this is child labor. I don't know that it's actually in the UK, but child labor laws in the UK did not come about because politicians were thinking that, you know, we want to regulate child labor. Child labor is something it's a bad thing. It was actually something that came out of industry. And in this case, it maybe actually came out of industry that was inefficient because child labor laws came about as there were starting to be new technologies that came online, and there were certain things that kids are actually really good at doing. And having small hands is helpful. You know, being able to work kids in certain ways is helpful for production. And there were new technologies like machine looms that came along, and those actually weren't as competitive necessarily of a technology. But if you're the firms that spent a lot of money on R&D, inventing the new technology, you kind of want to put the kids out of business, and your competitors that have that technology, right? And so you can benefit by using, you know, this is a socially efficient thing to do. We want kids in school. We want new invention, right? All these good reasons to get rid of child labor. You can argue for to a politician, and politicians that, you know, are representing certain people. This is going to appeal and be good. It's also, in this case, good for kind of the owners of this new capital and new technology, right? So there's a long history of actually laws coming into place, you know, related to social responsibility, essentially, because this is what the government's supposed to do, right? It's supposed to look out for the public interest, and when firms are doing that, that can align with the laws. So it's at least, you know, kind of that old. So we can think about cases in the U.S. too where this is true. There's a case that's going to be a Stigler Center case coming out soon that I'm writing that's on this, and so just we'll dig into it a little bit. So this is going to be about HP and electronic waste regulation. And so electronic waste is a problem, right? So when you have a computer or you have mercury in it, you have other sort of harmful components, and so at the end of its life, right, as technology progresses, you're supposed to recycle these things. People still don't necessarily know this, but it's, you know, extremely harmful if these things end up in landfills. And so there's at least two ways to solve the problem. So one way could be a point-of-sale tax on consumers. And California actually did pass a law that was a point-of-sale tax on computers. So if you buy a computer in California, you pay $10, it goes to the government runs its own e-waste facilities, so it tries to take electronics and do the right thing themselves with this in terms of recycling it. That leads to one outcome, right? So it's transfer from firms, or actually on consumers directly, right, to the government. The government then sets up a program to run something. Another way you could do this is to have something that's called producer responsibility. And producer responsibility would be a different system where you actually require firms that manufacture electronics to take on some of the responsibility themselves. So you could say that they are responsible for recycling it, and they have to pay the fees. That's going to change the incentives for firms doing this, because then they have incentives to use less harmful materials, to figure out ways to make the end of life easier for recycling products, etc. And so you're going to get, you know, a different social optimality of these two programs. One is you're setting up something that doesn't create any incentives for firms to actually take any responsibility themselves in terms of the manufacturing process and in terms of making something easy to recycle. And, you know, it's a tax on consumers. That looks bad for politicians, right? In this first case. In the second case, firms, individuals buying computers are still going to pay more, right? But they're not going to see it because it's going to be internalized in the price. Then the manufacturers are going to have an incentive to actually figure out how to kind of more efficiently produce computers in a way where they also reduce the environmental harm of them. And so there's sort of two alternatives here. The easy way for politicians, if they're thinking we have this problem, we want to be visible about it, is the tax, but it's probably not optimal for politicians and not socially optimal. So in this instance, HP had actually invested in a facility or two facilities. They were losing money on it. They'd acknowledged they were losing money on these things, where they set up these take-back programs. They would take any HP product back, and there's some recovery of materials. It's valuable in terms of recycling for them. Regardless, they're still losing money. They were ahead of their competitors on this, so Dell being their main competitor at this point in time, but Dell didn't have a similar program, right? So Dell didn't have the prior investment. They weren't as socially responsible on these grounds. So HP could look at this law in California and take it around and say, you know what, this tax isn't really the way to go. we've thought about this a lot. We've figured out how to internalize this and make better computers. You really don't want to be recycling the computers that are manufactured by Dell because it's more costly to do. You want us to take on the responsibility. And that sounds very compelling when you're talking to a politician, particularly since politicians do not want to raise taxes on consumers, especially not a visible tax that shows up as a line on a receipt, right? And a special line for the special thing. And so they're able to win the day, and they were able to do this by creating a model bill, which is actually a very common thing. So firms write legislation. There's some really interesting research on this too. In California, if a firm writes legislation, their name actually appears in the bottom that they've written it. And so you can go through and see something. There's a woman named Mary Kroger at the University of Rochester's Political Science Department who studies this stuff. And it's really cool because you can see how many bills are written by firms or outside groups, and it's actually a really high fraction of bills in California. We don't have that in other states, but a model bill is great for a politician, right? Because this credit claiming thing that Mayhew's interested in, it allows a politician to sponsor a bill, say they sponsored this bill, say they're doing things that improve the environment, say they're not raising taxes, even though implicitly we know in this case the price of computers is still going to go up if it's internalized by firms, maybe up by less, but still up. And so it's good for politicians. And they can also, the firms can go around and think about, well, which constituencies where are going to be more interested in this, and they can start approaching states where there's going to be sympathetic voters, right? And that's exactly what HP did. And so, as of today, starting in California, they actually have this tax in California, so the way that HP wouldn't want it, even though it's their home state, they're able to take this and go around to other states and actually pass some legislation that it looks like what they want. More states start passing legislation, and this is obviously just a correlation here, but HP's market share ends up going up relative to Dell, basically because they were more socially responsible, able to convince politicians that this social responsibility was a good thing. And it lowered the cost for politicians to pass laws that were favorable, right? So laws look more like what the politicians want. Politicians get to claim credit. The politicians do well with constituents in re-election because the firm's helping them out based on their social responsibility profile. So that's going to be a case, Stigler case, that anybody teaching at any other business school will be able to use, and it's going to be available for free. Another way that social responsibility can work is to think about, well, maybe there's something good about being associated with firms that are more socially responsible for politicians, just at face value, other than this kind of mechanism of the firms are writing laws explicitly. And we can see that through my colleague at Texas's Tim Werner's research, where he looks at Congress and data on congressional hearing invitations, or who's actually testifying in front of Congress, and levels of firm social responsibility. And sort of unsurprisingly, given what I'm saying here, there's a strong correlation between getting invited to testify in front of Congress in a non-confrontational way. So this isn't Mark Zuckerberg in front of the House and the Senate getting grilled for having done something wrong, but this is the opposite, right? This is being invited to hearings that are at exploratory phases of the laws, and what do you have to say as a firm when Congress is going to regulate and politicians are going to regulate this firm in some way, or establish a framework for regulation at least. And so being socially responsible actually leads to a higher invitation rate than not. And this is suggestive that policymakers actually value this. It's going to look good for constituents to be associated with, and you still saw this in Mark Zuckerberg's hearings. Like, some politicians were like, I love Facebook and you guys are great, because they have a high reputation overall, but they don't necessarily have a social responsibility reputation. And so Tim looked specifically at that. Yes?
You mentioned that high social responsibilities are also lobbying around that.
So this study doesn't separate the two. So the question was, I mentioned earlier, firms that lobby more actively, also, have higher social responsibility reputations. So he frames the paper at least as about access, and we know that access is granted because we see them actually appearing in Congress. You don't testify and not have private meetings on the side, and so there's at least a sense that the lobbying is working, because you could spend money on lobbying and we wouldn't know that it would work. And what this paper does, it's a little bit different, is it shows that some measure of it working, and in that there's at least an interaction that happens in a sort of public way, and probably more other interactions that happen on the side. Because time with politicians is hard to get, and social responsibility might be one of the ways to get that, sort of in addition to the money type of things we thought about last time. So Tim Werner also has some other researches with May McDonnell, and what they do is they actually try to think about this in another way, which is, well, what happens if you're a bad firm, a socially irresponsible firm, and how would some reputation shock there affect politicians' desire to help those firms out? And to do this, they have a data set of public protests of firms and boycotts of firms, and data on campaign contributions. And so this is the direct dollar stuff we talked about last time. And we tend to always think about dollars flowing from firms to politicians. It turns out if you go through the data, there's actually refunds in there where politicians will give money back to firms, right? This is like giving back the gift. It's in a lot of ways, if you did that in like a Christmas gift or wedding gift or something, that would be considered probably pretty rude. And so this, it's a similar thing, right? These are politicians. The money could be valuable to them in running an election campaign. They do give money back to some firms or some individuals. Sometimes that's because it's in violation of law, and other times it's just because they don't want to be associated with these people, right? So last time we talked a little bit about how there are some politicians that refuse PAC donations. Across the board, they're going to do this, but there's other politicians that do it rarely. And it turns out that, correlated with the timing of protests against firms, politicians will refund money from PAC contributions, right? And so if a firm's PAC has made a contribution to a candidate, and that candidate, and then something bad happens to that firm, and they show up in the media, in a way of sort of looking like a bad firm, the politicians start to want to disassociate themselves, and they're less likely, again, the implication is to pass policy for them, right? And so you can effectively end up being blacklisted in politics for being a bad firm and for having a reputation of being a bad firm. And again, Facebook right now is sort of an easy way to think about this, right? Facebook had this good reputation on some dimensions, but what's happened sort of recently, with election tampering, and were they subject to that, and were they influencing election outcomes, has really hurt their ability to get certain types of public policy done. And so their reputation for how socially responsible or irresponsible they are has a huge impact on whether or not they're going to get the policy outcomes that they want. So this is sort of the evidence that we have right now in what is a growing space at this sort of interface between politics and social responsibility. So constituencies are the other thing that we should really care about. Everything that's going on in the social responsibility front is thinking about, okay, well, how do firms interact with politicians in a way that the politicians start to look good? Constituencies are who they're trying to look good to. So there's a little bit of research that exists in this space that's trying to get directly at, well, who matters more, constituents or donors, and how could you do that? And so I don't know Kyle's first name. I'm actually forgetting Brookman's first name. But so Brookman's out at Stanford GSB, and he wrote this when he was a PhD in political science at Berkeley, but they wrote a paper where they actually ran a field experiment on people in Congress. Or offices, congressional offices, where they started writing letters, said, hey, I want to have a meeting on a bill, I'm from this interest group, and they sort of randomized which politicians were going to get what. They randomized either saying that they were a constituent or a donor, and they tried to look at, well, do I actually get access to politicians? And so, how much does it matter to be a constituent versus how much it would matter to be a donor in terms of the access that politicians would grant them to meetings. So it's a really cool way to try to get at this, and we know that there should be some kind of relationship. These are what the results are. So they look at how high of a level of meeting do you get. So obviously a meeting with a member of Congress is more valuable than a meeting with their chief of staff or the district staff. So sort of in the local area where the voters reside. And we'd see that if you were a constituent, you're getting these lower level meetings that were sort of in the field offices and not directly with the politician himself, or high level staff at the same rate. And if you were a donor, you were more likely to get more direct access to sort of the top. And so there is some implication of this, at least if you're an interest group, they're not identifying as a firm, but as more of like a public interest type of group, that identifying as a constituent has some value, but identifying as a donor maybe has a little bit more value. Obviously, if you could combine the two, right, that might be a better situation. And so we still might see a relationship, where we put it together. This doesn't quite get at what the trade-offs are, and so it's a limitation to the research. Fortunately, there's other research on this. And so Francesco Trebbi and Matilda Bombardini, Trebbi used to be here, and he was here when he wrote this paper, really tried to look at, well, what's the trade-off between, how much would it cost in terms of an extra vote for a politician for a campaign contribution, and how do we get at that? And they started looking at employment and industry PAC contributions. And so in doing this, they uncovered a relationship, which essentially says there is some trade-off, right? If you have lots of potential votes that you can deliver to a politician, you actually donate less money on average. And so this is Walmart, and Walmart employment by state and how much they're contributing to the senators in those states. Arkansas is obviously a little bit of an outlier over here because we know that's where Walmart's headquartered, right? And so that relationship's different because corporate headquarters might influence the relationship a little bit differently. If you still run the regression on this part of the distribution, throw out the outlier in Walmart, you get a similar shape, which is that if you can potentially deliver a lot of votes through your employees to a politician, then you don't need to pay them as much money to get outcomes, is the implication if Walmart's acting efficiently here. If you don't have a lot of employees, you maybe aren't going to give any money because you probably can't influence that politician anyway, or they're not going to care, right? And so there is a relationship. They also come up with an approximation in this paper that one vote's approximately worth $145 if you're a politician, and that's sort of the trade-off you'd make of how much less money you'd be interested in for from a particular firm. So we can also start thinking about examples of how politicians think about this. There's a Planet Money podcast on essentially inefficient sugar policy in the U.S. And this guy, Colin Peterson, I misspelled his name here, there should be 2 L's in it, is kind of on this he wants to set price floors on sugar in the U.S. So he represents this district that's in the western half of Minnesota, up to the Canadian border, really rural, and the sugar beet industry is there, where there are price floors on this. If you're manufacturing lollipops, it turns out you want to import Mexican sugar that's much cheaper. But if you're buying sugar in the U.S., there's a price floor, and so there's this policy debate over this. And he's in this Planet Money interview, and he's saying, I don't need any money, right? This is the economic activity in my district. I represent these firms essentially, right? And so I can't ignore this because my job is to think about my constituents. My constituents do include firms. And I'd come up with these same essentially trade protectionist policies that we know are socially inefficient in aggregate because it's good for my district and it's good for people who are sending me to Congress. And so we end up with these types of outcomes, not because of money in politics, or at least he's saying not because of money in politics. It's not surprising the sugar beet industry still contributes to him, but they may be doing that because they like his policies, and he may be doing coming up with the policies that he's interested in and going to go down with because it's going to benefit these firms who he's essentially been elected to represent, or at least that's his view of things. And so we can look at this and we can be really upset about it. Most people are upset at Congress, and this is something that's the political science literature calls Fano's paradox. So this is people hate Congress, people hate that somebody like this exists. It gets worse and worse over time. He's clearly benefiting some special interest. We don't know if he's doing it because he's getting money or if his statement's true. But at the same time, when we start polling people about, do you like your own member of Congress, they really do like their own member of Congress, right? And that's because these guys do the best job possible to represent their constituents in their districts. And there's some fuzzy line between our special interests and their constituents the same or not, right? And this is what we're seeing in this case in Minnesota, where there's a very blurry line between the sugar beet industry, employment, and who and the policies that we're going to get out of this, right? District and this congressman, and it wouldn't matter if it were Colin Peterson or anybody else necessarily. If you're going to run for that district, you better be doing things that are good for the sugar beet industry, right? Otherwise, you're not going to win. And so these are consequences of the way that our political system works, and a source of influence, right? Is this political geography connection directly to members of Congress who, we dislike at large, but we like our own person because our own person's doing what we want them to do. So this brings us to trying to understand political geography and how it affects political influence. And this is sort of where my research is going, so I'm happy to get to talk about that now. So there's this large literature on gerrymandering, redistricting, which fundamentally determines what these political districts are in the US, and the political consequences of it. There's almost nothing to date trying to look at economic consequences, and in particular economic consequences on farms. And so this is something that we should be studying, something that I have started studying, yet the public is fairly unaware of this. I'm sure people in this room are more intelligent than the average crowd by a long shot, but we're still probably have people who don't know a whole lot about redistricting, how it's done, who draws the lines. I study this stuff. I couldn't tell you how the lines are drawn in Illinois. I can tell you how they're drawn in Texas. But what we see that only about 10% of people claim to know anything about a redistricting debate. Granted, this is a 10-year-old poll, but there's not a lot of polls on this. There doesn't seem to be a lot of public interest in it. Yet there's a lot going on right now, and people don't know any of these technical details of how this works in different states, what might be done about redistricting and the redistricting process, and certainly not how it relates to firms, because nobody's done research on that, so we don't know much about it until right now. So you're going to see new stuff. It's also really important as a topic right now. There are 2 Supreme Court cases that are currently under consideration. One of the star defendants in this Wisconsin case is actually a Chicago law professor who came up with a measure of redistricting. So in Wisconsin, the legislature's essentially been accused of, Republican legislature's essentially been accused of manipulating the lines and the way they're drawn. And the question is that true? Can we measure it? If we can measure it, is that illegal? Or does it violate the Constitution? There's a case in Maryland. It's essentially the opposite case, where Maryland has been gerrymandered by Democrats. And so they're hearing 2 cases right now. In the next month and a half, we're basically due for a decision on these cases, and that decision is going to be consequential. This is also a very old topic, right? So the idea of redistricting and creating these funny-looking districts is something that goes back a really long time. So this is a political cartoon from 1812. And we call it gerrymandering now. It's technically Gerry. This is Elbridge Gerry, was this governor in Massachusetts who was sort of the first person to realize he could create some funny-looking lines that I guess the newspaper said it looked like a salamander, right? And that's where mander came in. So it's Gerry for Elbridge Gerry, and then mander put together, and that's where the term comes from. So he was trying to protect his partisan interests and consolidate his power, and this is why he did this. And we ended up with these funny outcomes, right? And it still persists today. We've got Reagan talking about how it's a national scandal and that we shouldn't have this. We also have Obama talking about this. So in Obama's last State of the Union, if you go back and you listen to what he had to say, if he had something to point to as what's wrong with politics in the United States, it wasn't money in politics, even though that's what we talked about last time and kind of what the media thinks, something Obama doesn't like also. But his number one thing that he had a problem with in politics in the US was actually the redistricting process, right? And he said, if we can fix this, then we can fix the way politics are going to work in the US and end up with a better politics, was the term he used. So it's something that actually garners attention on sort of both sides of the aisle and high profile people in both parties. It's also an important group for some advocacy groups, yet we don't still have this broad public attention. There's creative things that are done around it because we end up with really funky looking districts. So there's a 5K in Asheville, North Carolina, that was put on by a League of Women Voters, and they were concerned about what these district lines look like, and they knew the public doesn't know a whole lot about it, and they were trying to bring attention to it. And so they ran along these really funny routes that trace the edges of the district, where somebody's house is carved out, and you've got to run around somebody's house. Because like one house is carved out of this district, and you actually, being running this 5K, you're going to realize, okay, there's something funny going on here. Like, why doesn't it just go down the major street? That would be a more rational way to draw a district than in this way. And so they're trying to create attention for this. And these groups exist. They haven't been heard for whatever reason as loudly as the groups on money and politics. It's also something firms are interested in. So, firms are interested in explicitly where the lines get drawn around them. And it's hard to actually see the lobbying on this that happens. You can see it in a couple instances. So in Florida, there were some ballot propositions about changing who was going to draw the lines and how the lines were going to be drawn, and it was potentially going to hurt some firms more than anybody else because the firms were entrenched in certain districts. And so you can go and you can look at who donated to what side of these ballot propositions and groups around that. And you can see that firms sort of lined up on one side to basically keep the districts as entrenched as possible and to not change the process, essentially because they liked what the district looked like for their current congresspeople. And so we see firms lobby on this. You can also see it happen in California. There are lobbyists that pop up there. In California, they actually have an independent commission now who draws the lines, and they have a Twitter account that says, "We draw the lines," at "We draw the lines," and then there's a lobbyist that showed up with a Twitter account that says, at "You draw the lines." And you can go to this guy's website, and you can hire him, and he'll figure out how to testify in front of this independent commission in the language that the independent commission wants to be able to draw the lines that you want to draw them, or the way that you want to draw them. And so, lobbyists show up and specialize in these topics explicitly.
Do you know anything about the Iowa? I've heard the Iowa system is very fair, but do you know anything about
Iowa also has an independent commission. So I can tell you that. I can't tell you a whole lot about the process of how it works, but they do have an independent commission, and that's certainly an alternative for how to do this. There's a great podcast on 538 about gerrymandering. If you're more interested in it, I definitely recommend it. It's not as good as Luigi's podcast, so you should listen to that one first. But then once you've listened to all of Luigi's, then go and start listening to the podcast on gerrymandering on 538. They're longer episodes. They're about an hour each, but they get into actually how you can still end up with bias, in instances with independent commissions, et cetera. And the California case is certainly one of those. So we see gerrymandering happens to firms. Here's a district that looks a little bit funny around Columbus, Ohio. That's we look at it and probably say it's gerrymandered. It's actually not always clear what gerrymandering means. We'll get into that in a little bit. Defining it's actually super tricky. But Nationwide is a big insurance company. They're headquartered in Columbus, Ohio. They happen to be at this weird kink in a district. Nobody resides at Nationwide, so the way that you're going to be counting voters is not going to be influenced by which district Nationwide is in. But I'm sure there's a reason why Nationwide is in the district that it's in, given that it happens to be at the edge of this line in a business district that nobody resides in, right? And so the line was drawn clearly very intentionally in one side of the street to incorporate this firm's headquarters, and this stuff should have consequences, right? Depending upon where we draw the lines around certain firms, politicians are going to have different incentives to do things for those firms. So how does this process work in general is a big question. It's something that we tend not to get taught in civics classes in the U.S. As kids, as 8th graders, I think is the last time I really learned about American politics in the U.S. in a formal school setting that every American's going to get. But this is something that actually has to happen, right? So the Constitution requires that we have a census, and the census requires rebalancing a district so we have equal number of voters for every politician. Is this a question? Okay. So we need equal number of voters in every district, and we have to count people, right? So some states end up getting through what's called reappropriation rather than redistricting, an extra representative, or they lose a representative, right? As population shifts across states, the numbers go up over time in the aggregate population, and then we've got to redivide this. It's a really complicated thing to do, and so some states gain or lose districts. But beyond those states, we still need to redraw the lines, at a lower level. So unless you're in one of the 7 states that have a small enough population that they only have 1 House member, all the lines get redrawn every 10 years because you have people moving within cities or across cities, or you have urbanization or you have suburbanization happen. And as those things happen, people have moved and these new lines need to be drawn, and we end up with politicians representing slightly different sets of people. This is going to be really useful for us, as researchers, if we're trying to identify, well, what happens if a firm gets redistricted, or what's the connections between constituents and firms, because we can see that these firms have actually, or the politicians are representing different people now, right? And so we use this to start to get at voting and how this happens. So in different states, this is also done different ways, right? So in some states, you have a partisan legislature. The legislature is responsible for drawing the lines. So this is what happens in Texas. It's a Republican-dominated legislature. So the Republican Party basically draws the line. You'll see, one map announced. You'll see some other caucuses announce maps that you shouldn't take that seriously. There's other states where there's big, public fight between different parties. You'll see 7 or 8 different maps announced for potential maps, and that'll be negotiated between the parties. There's states like Iowa and California that have independent commissions where supposedly citizens are going to draw these lines and do this in a more fair way. Turns out that may or may not be fair. Courts also get involved in a lot of instances because there's something illegal about the way the maps are drawn. Since Voting Rights Act, we're actually required to have majority-minority districts in some states, particularly states that have sort of a history of racism. And so to make sure that those voices get heard, we end up with districts that look like they either need to have essentially more African Americans or more Hispanic population, et cetera. And the courts tend to get involved in those cases in particular. Some states actually even need pre-approval of maps to satisfy these judicial requirements still. And so each state's going to announce a map on a different day. They get data from the U.S. Census, of exactly where people live. And then there's this complicated bargaining process that happens, according to one of these state-level institutions, on what these new lines are going to look like. So different timing, different systems in terms of who's drawing it. So as a research question, what I'm interested in studying and try to study is what's the value of this political geography, and particularly as it changes to firms, and can we sort of look at this redistricting process and figure out does this matter at all to firms, the district they're embedded in. And we can think about physical aspects of these districts changing, right? Because just the geographic area is going to change, or we can think about partisan aspects and who the voters are in the district and how that matters. And we can start doing this through an event study type of framework where we look at valuation changes and how the stock market reacts on days that these new maps are announced and new districts lines are drawn. So one simple way to think about this is 2 firms near each other. Right, you can draw some district around them. It looks like this, and think of them as identical firms. This redistricting process happens, once every 10 years, and in this instance, we end up with 2 very different districts being drawn, and one, has a lot of overlap with the old district. It looks like they've basically, you can imagine the same politician's going to run in that district that A is in, but not that B is in, and we want to try to figure out who's going to fare better. Turns out that for the most part, firms tend to suffer, as there are bigger changes in their district at the very extreme end. That doesn't always seem to be the case. There's some probably, reverse sorting that could happen of maybe politicians are choosing certain firms. It's a different question that I'm trying to get at here, and one I haven't studied yet, but one that I intend to. So we see that happen. Another way to think about this is we can think about the partisan nature of districts. So we can think about these 2 firms as being identical, and the thought experiment here is that, okay, well, they're identical firms. They happen to be in different districts. One district is blue. The other district's purple, right? So blue, 75% Democrats, say. The other district's like 50-50, Republicans and Democrats. And then we want to see what happens to these firms basically as their partisan nature changes, right? So, firm Y moves into something that's partisan competitive from, partisan safe. Firm X does the opposite, moves to partisan safety for the politician representing their district, and how are these firms going to fare relative to each other. We also want to try to figure out to see, do districts matter, do voters matter to firms? And turns out that they do, and that firms actually benefit on the margin from being in a safer district or a district that doesn't change, and firms suffer when they get moved to a district that becomes more politically competitive. So as we see a partisan balance in terms of the electorate, we see that firms suffer. So this stuff's actually really hard to get at in the data. It's really hard to measure redistricting. So those were, these simplified abstract concepts. So how are we going to do this in data? We're going to go get firms and we're going to use geocoding software, place them in these districts. We're going to take the software on these maps, the lines where people are, and we're going to do this with firms' headquarters, right? So we know firms employ people beyond their headquarters, and that should matter potentially. Fortunately, different states announce things on different dates, and so the statistical problem solved a little bit. And then we're going to think about 2 different ways that this can change. One is this partisan overlap, so that's what I was trying to illustrate with the first one, and the other one is changes in partisan constituent makeup. So here's what the data looks like on the change in the district area, pre and post redistricting. Vis-a-vis, these are all publicly traded firms in the US, the last redistricting cycle. So we see a lot of firms don't change the district they're in a whole lot, right? So this is 0 to 5% bin, and a histogram, about 15% of firms, not a lot of physical change in the area that they're in. And we see that at the extreme, there are some firms that end up in basically entirely new districts. If we index this instead by politicians and anchored the politicians to the districts, we'd see less change than this, right? There'd be less change. So firms tend to be located in districts where there is more change on the margin. We can think of a lot of reasons why that might happen, right? So in urban areas, it's easier to have bigger changes, relative to what's there before. But we do see a lot of change in the districts firms are in. And so this is a regression against changes in valuation around these announcements of the new maps and the new maps that become adopted. And what we see is that, in general, there's this downward sort of relationship where it costs firms more, essentially in terms of evaluation, the bigger the change in the district that they experience, right? So if they were in a district that largely overlapped with before, then that's going to change a lot. The other thing that we can look at or think about is, well, what's the data actually look like on transitions for partisanship? And when we think about that, we can create sort of a transition matrix of, the columns are what it looks like before redistricting, and then the top sort of index is what it looks like after redistricting. So we can think about these firms along the diagonal as really not changing the district at all, right? So before and after redistricting, they stayed in a safe Democratic district or a safe Republican district, et cetera. Not a lot of change. The rest of it, we can sort of identify some changes in and how the effects of moving might be. Something else interesting here that I think is interesting by itself, which is understudied because people haven't really thought about the political geography of firms, is actually that most firms are located in these safe Democratic districts. That's surprising to a lot of people because people tend to think of politicians as doing a better job representing Republicans, or Republicans better represent firms in general. Tends to be sort of the stereotypical view. Turns out that firms tend to reside in districts where Democrats are. Maybe less surprising when we think about urban areas, and Democrats tend to represent urban areas. But it also might say something about the Democratic Party, and that's worth investigating in the future, because there might be two types of Democrats, really, right? Democrats that represent firms and Democrats that don't, and they might have very different political inclinations. So then we can go through and kind of parse out, okay, well, what happens if you transition from Republican to Democrat or Democrat to Republican? What happens if you move from a safe district or a district that's not going to transition parties to a safe party? What's going to happen if you transition to a more competitive district? And we can use this data and these different cells to try to figure out what happens when we run a regression on this. What we end up seeing is that this result that I've told you guys before, that there's kind of a valuation difference between firms that get moved to competitive districts versus firms that stay in safer districts. And so that's about 2% of the value of the firm we're estimating here. There's lots of reasons why that might be a small number, actually, and it may be worth more, the district of firms embedded in. There seems to be some marginal value to ending up in a Republican district, but there's lots of reasons to believe that's not the most credible or solid result. So, again, there's some cost to being moved to a competitive district, and this is really what we're finding. And so just, we're showing this in two different ways. The political geography matters to firms. So then the question really becomes, okay, well, what do we know about, why might this be happening? Why is partisanship of a district going to matter to a firm that resides in that district? And why do firms benefit, essentially from being in heavily partisan districts rather than competitive districts? We can think of a bunch of reasons why this might happen. So one might just be uncertainty over the politician, right? You end up in a new district and you get a politician that's going to change, or you're going to have a change in the politician in the future. So it may say something just about the long-term relationship a firm has with its politician, and the redistricting becomes a shock to that. It could also just change the relationship that a current politician has with a firm vis-a-vis their constituents, right? Because now they have to run a tighter re-election race. They may be able to do less directly for the firm, or they need to think more carefully about the optics of these things, right? It's the social responsibility type of stuff, what they can claim credit for, what they don't want to claim credit for, all becomes more sensitive in a district where you actually have to think about your job being on the line as a politician. You may have to go and raise more money. That may be time consuming. You may have to spend more time campaigning. All of these things may actually reduce the ability of a politician to be effective at creating legislation, and in particular creating legislation that's helpful for the firm, or it may just change the ideology of the politician, and that might be consistent with sort of this idea that the Republican districts maybe do better, and if Republicans really do serve firms better, then the ideology elected might be helpful. So what can we learn from this redistricting and gerrymandering stuff about business politics relationship? I think there's some good news from it, right? There's a constraint on politicians in terms of money. Presumably, if these districts matter, because it says that politicians are actually, in some ways, responsive to their districts. If they're responsive, if they need to be concerned about re-election, if they don't need to be, then maybe not. And the other thing it's telling us is that political science can actually matter for these economic outcomes for firms. There's definitely some bad news in this too, which is that we're in a system where districts are becoming more heavily partisan. And as districts become more heavily partisan, if you're a firm that's located in those, you're going to get more benefits out of the politician. So if you're thinking firm strategy and where do I locate my firm, you want to find a stable district where you have a politician that's going to be in one party or the other. Yes?
It seems like you're using the location of the headquarters as a proxy for where the employees are, where the economic activity is. So it doesn't really matter to anyone where the headquarters is, right?
Yeah, so ideally, headquarters is not the best measure of location. It's the measure that I have. If I could know exactly where every employee of every firm was, that would be better data. I don't have that data, and if I did, I would study this in a slightly different way. So yes, it's a proxy for a bunch of things, and moving the district may not actually move employees too, and so it says different things, and you're right that we need to be careful in interpreting the results. Vis-a-vis headquarters, not all employment or all everything else. Yes.
I mean, kind of related to that, isn't it quite possible that the elected that's most important, or even important at all to a firm, has nothing to do with where they're located? Like if you're a defense contractor, if you're a defense contractor, doesn't it? And you live, and you're not based in a district where someone's on the Defense Appropriations Committee. Why would it matter to you what your local?
That's absolutely true. So I'm not saying that other politicians don't matter.
But they could matter not at all, right?
The local politician, may matter not at all. If they matter not at all, I shouldn't have any results here of the local politician mattering, or the characteristics of the voters that elect the local politician shouldn't matter to a firm. And so I'm not saying other politicians don't matter, but I am saying that that the local voters have something to do with the local politician, and we kind of have to make that leap to get to a result here. But certainly, the single most important politician to a given firm may not be their local politician. Yes?
Is your research taking into account these large metropolitan areas like Chicago and New York? We have all these conservative suburban commuters coming in. The headquarters and a few executives might live in the city in an expensive condo, but you have these bedroom communities where people are clearly in the collar areas Republican or more conservative. Have you thought about that or researched?
So the question is, did we think about, how large urban areas and commuters affect things? So we didn't think directly about commuters. Commuters are hard to get at, right? So this is a problem we don't have a data solution to. We would like to know where people live that work for certain firms, and how that maybe influences outcomes. There are some people that try to get at that with money, at least in different ways, or money in politics, associated with employees. What we do related to bigger cities too is that we know that there are more firms located in them, and Boeing is headquartered in Chicago. We know Boeing's really sort of a Seattle-based firm and a Washington State firm, and so we in a robustness check try to exclude big cities where firms might just be headquartered, and the results hold up in those instances. So it's something we have thought about, and it's related to kind of imperfect data. So I want to go through a couple concluding thoughts, and then can take some more questions. So main point of today, on these alternative sources is there's actually a lot of other ways that firms can have some influence over politics that we tend to ignore. Because it's really easy to look at money. Money leaves receipts. These things like social responsibility are very nebulous, hard to measure, hard to see in a concrete way. Things like political geography, I can put up pictures, and it's easy to see that nationwide's at this kink point. But it's something that we don't think about a lot, in the public. And these things do, either add influence to some firms or constrain some firms' influence. And so we need to be thinking about these things too. when we're thinking about the Tulloch paradox, and particularly when you think about what kind of the counterfactual policy outcome or services that could be delivered by politicians are, if we're going to have a debate on money in politics and how much money there is. And so this stuff does relate directly to that kind of numerator and government benefits that are available. And I think a lot of it suggests that this may be smaller than we think, because there are a lot of constraints on what firms can actually get out of politicians, because politicians do want to be reelected. And so the benefits that are available to a particular firm, they may be predetermined, even if there is no money in politics, or they may be more influenceable or less influenceable for different politicians. And so if we want to think about the Tulloch paradox, just thinking about this numerator and constraints on politicians, the entire government budget isn't up for movement. Like, some of it is, but a very sort of smaller fraction of this. And so this political geography stuff says that we need to go beyond thinking about Stigler and just firms wanting to capture government, but we need to. Peltzman, who was also here and added a lot to capture theory, said we need to start thinking really about politicians and votes too. And so constraints on politicians do matter. And so representation should also matter to firms, given that. And firms and politicians have this kind of relational contract with each other, but politicians also have this relational contract with their constituents, and they're kind of trying to balance these two things. One other thing I think I want to say is that, and this is probably a controversial thing to say, is this Go versus Whitford and Lamont Benesek, these two Supreme Court cases on redistricting, I actually think could have a bigger influence on business-government relationships than Citizens United and the stuff that gets a lot of media attention today, because it could fundamentally shift the way that district lines are drawn. We could end up with more competitive districts if the Supreme Court does one thing, or we could end up with more entrenched districts another way. If we end up with more entrenched districts, we're going to see firms should probably be able to extract a little bit more out of the government. If we move to more competitive districts across the country, then we're going to probably see a lot of firms that are getting less out of the government, because politicians have to think a lot more about their constituents relative to firms. Not that there's not overlap, right? There's some fuzzy lines there. But this is going to have major consequences. And I don't think people are thinking about the consequences on firms directly, but they're going to be there. So, is there too much money in politics? Yesterday I think we said that or today we're saying the numerator is more limited or smaller than we think, right? So there's probably less government benefits than we thought. Yesterday we kind of got there's actually more money in politics than we could sort of directly observe, and you put that all together, it's just maybe the sort of market for political favors is actually pretty close to right here, right? We can't quantify either of these things very precisely. But these things start going in the directions that bring down the returns on political investment, and that might be why we don't see more money in politics. Is that there's not as many benefits available as we think, because there are all these constraints, and there's actually more money than we think because there's all these hidden avenues, given how it's regulated. That's not to say there's not imperfections in a political marketplace, right? This is far from a perfectly functioning market, right? There's a limited number of politicians who are potentially selling favors. The politicians aren't homogenous, right? They're constrained differently by their constituents. There's price caps in this market. You wouldn't want that in a perfectly competitive market. So there's lots of things that are off from our notion of a perfectly competitive market, where we should have this equilibrium, allocative efficiency type of thing going on. And all these factors are going to influence the way that who gets the best deal out of politicians and which firms do. Some of these things are constraining firms, some of them are new firms, some are benefiting incumbent firms or incumbent politicians, and there's a redistributive nature to all these sort of failures to be a perfectly competitive political marketplace. So sort of last slide is, we really need to be thinking about business and politics, not just from an econ type of point of view or a political science point of view, but we need to be able to put the whole thing together if we want to think about business-government relationships in a more productive way. And this is a good thing the Stigler Center is doing to try to bridge across academic disciplines. And it's nice it's housed in a business school in that sense. So any questions? I'm open for.
Yeah, so I'm trying to, evidently, the impact of geography is hard to assess. So I'm trying to, I guess, wrap my hand around how the market as a whole, analyst or the market forces would then say, let's punish this company for a change in redistricting by a lower valuation. Could we then perhaps see the lower valuation as a cost of doing business, where the politician pressures a company to take decisions in the long term depress their valuation. Say, don't do layoffs. So it's almost like money in politics by subsidizing the campaign.
There is some evidence of this, right? So, there's a relational contract, I think, that firms and politicians develop, where politicians can certainly ask firms for things, right? And firms may have incentives to respond, right? And so don't do layoffs. I mean, we've seen that happen, right? This happens publicly now, and it's something where firms do sometimes respond to this if they think that there's a long run benefit to caving into a politician's demand sometimes. And so, it also, is a constraint on a firm. It may impose a cost on a firm to have a particular politician that's going to behave in particular ways. And this might be one of those reasons why competitive districts, are less good for firms to be in terms of their value, is they may actually have to be more responsive to politicians. And, I've done some suggestive work on that where I look at campaign contributions and how firms' campaign contributions change. It's highly preliminary, but it seems to suggest that, when a firm has the same politician they had before and they move to a more competitive district, they increase the amount of money they're giving that politician through campaign contributions, which could be a request from the politician, hey, I've got a tight election. When they move to districts that are less competitive, they actually start decreasing the amount of money that they give these politicians, right? So very consistent with that Walmart figure, but also this idea that politicians maybe are even demanding money, or the firms are seeing that the politician has a need, right, and responding even if it's implicit rather than explicit. Yes.
You mentioned like a Twitter account for some guy who you draw the lines at.
How many other ways have you seen like firms in particular try and influence these independent commissions in like Arizona, Iowa, California?
I mean, so I haven't tried to. So the question is, how have I seen firms try to influence independent commissions? I mean, the way lobbying tends to work, right? We talked yesterday about lobbying really being about information. So it's about repackaging information. What this you draw the line guy says to do on his website is, he's going to repackage information in a way that fits with the rules for how the independent commission is supposed to make decisions, right? So they have a set of criteria they're supposed to be following, and he's taking the idea, the firm wants this, they're telling me they want this, and he's trying to figure out how do I construct the argument the other way. And so that's what he's doing in practice, or he claims to be doing in practice. I don't know what he actually does. Actually, in California, you can go and you can see the minutes of every public hearing on this. It's a very public process. I haven't gone through and tried to see, is he doing what he claims to be doing? I imagine there are lobbyists in other states, though, that depending on the process, are going to show up to the extent that firms do see a benefit in, their local politician, the district, their local politician. Different firms' incentives may be higher or lower depending upon how valuable they view their local politician as being. There's even reasons why they might want competitor firms in the same district as them too, right? Because that may consolidate a local politician's power on some key issues and may get them a committee assignment because now they're the politician that represents 7 Silicon Valley firms that are all really important, and there's some committee that's going to regulate all of those firms, and that person's going to have control, and so there may be incentives for firms to even get their competitors in the same district. I mean, there's a lot of subtle things that could be going on here. Yes.
This may be a little out of scope, but I'll ask it anyway. So lobbyists are really expensive, right? And firms large firms can afford them. So I'm curious, if there are any examples out there where you've had kind of small, independent, individual investors or even small nonprofit organizations who actually co-opt the firm, right? Or find that here's a firm that is pushing a policy measure, which we support, and let's get behind that firm, or let's buy its products, let's buy its actively becoming an investor and publicly going out and stating, yes, we're trying to use the firm just for this purpose.
So are lobbyists using lobbyists for sort of like public interest stuff, using firms to try to make a point? I'd be surprised if it doesn't happen. I can't tell you any specific stories about that. Another sort of source of unmeasured influence that we haven't talked about goes along these lines, but in a different way, and it's money that we also can't track, so thinking more like yesterday. But there are firms that exist to do what gets called astroturfing. So fake grassroots, because grassroots are the voters, and you can hire people to go and kind of protest on behalf of some issue, and it looks like they're citizens or voters in a district, but really there's some kind of PR firm behind it that stages a protest, and so that certainly exists where firms will hire kind of fake lobbyists. I would be surprised if it doesn't happen the other way around. In the social responsibility space, we see this happen a lot too. So there are certain environmental groups that are actually really good at establishing collaborative relationships with firms, right? To get certain things done, and part of that is to get certain policy outcomes, ultimately, right? That's the goal, and so. Something like the Environmental Defense Fund is known for doing that, right? And working and collaborating with firms. Let's invent this new technology. If this new technology takes off, they're going to go and lobby on this. And so they'll certainly actively partner with a firm, do something that's going to benefit them in the long run, and use firms in a collaborative way, and then go lobby on that sort of independently. But I don't, and these are these effective lobbying relationships. If you talk to a politician or you talk to a lobbyist, how do I get a policy passed? Just get two groups together that should naturally disagree, and let me walk both of them in at the same time into the same meeting with a congressman. And if I can get the doctors, the pharmaceutical companies, and the insurance companies together at the same time, and the hospitals, right, at the same time, and they all agree on something, there must be something good about what's going on here. This must be close to a socially efficient outcome, and so. I'm more inclined to buy that than if the pharmaceuticals companies come in by themselves and can't tell me about any social benefit and can't tell me why it's good for my constituents. Yes?
Do you have some prediction on whether the Supreme Court will adopt some criteria for unconstitutional redistricting?
So I don't have a great prediction on it. So I forget which justice. There was a comment during the Gill versus Whitford case about this looks like gobbledygook sociology, this mathematical metric about is a district gerrymandered or not. I mean that I think was supposed to be a pivotal justice in this decision, which makes it seem like the standard is not yet there for how do we quantify what a gerrymandered district is or a gerrymandered state. There seems to be some suggestion that if we can define gerrymandering in a way that's measurable, then maybe we can limit it. But right now, it's still too complicated to even define what a gerrymandered state is. And so this efficiency gap measure is what it's called. That's at the crux of this. And there are critiques of it. There are good things about it, but it's certainly not perfect. And we'll have to see what they do. I don't have a strong prediction. I think it looks like they want to do something. It's also interesting that they're hearing kind of this Maryland case. It's the Democrats doing the gerrymandering, and a Wisconsin case that's Republicans doing it, where they look like they want to appear balanced in whatever they're doing by hearing both cases. But we'll see. I don't have a strong prediction other than I know they seem to be a little bit opposed to the social science. Yes?
Even in these completely partisan redistricting cases, I mean, obviously there's winners and losers among the delegation. So
Right.
Is there research on how that happens, or how do you control that in your research?
So there's a ton of research on the consequences of redistricting on kind of political outcomes and how polarized we've become or how unpolarized we've become. There's not a lot of great research on kind of how the bargaining actually happens, because we end up with funnier district lines than you might think we'd have in terms of we don't end up with districts that are clearly 100% gerrymandered, right? There seems to be some responsiveness to the other party or some thinking about what the other party might want in the way that the lines are drawn, and they're even funkier than we think because they don't fit nicely with these sort of extreme stories about what you might want to do if you were trying to consolidate power to your party. So they don't get quite that far because there's some other thing going on in those negotiations, and that's about the most that we know about it. Is it predictable where these lines are going to go? At some level, there's a suggestion or a belief that the more powerful local politician for the party that draws the line in the states it's going to probably consolidate more power. You know, every politician, if you ask them, wants the safest district possible, or they think they do. But this has started to actually also become an increasingly complex question because there's the idea that you might get primaried, right? So like this happened to Eric Cantor in Virginia, who was prominent politician in the state, and then he lost the primary because he wasn't actually extreme enough within his party, even though Okay. Well, thank you.
Thank you.